Have you ever felt a thin veil between reality and dream shatter? When a line blurs and you're no longer sure if what you experienced was a nightmare or something much worse. My name is Ezra Kincaid, and my work as an art restorer means I spend my days breathing life into forgotten pieces of history. But one night, I stumbled into something from the past that should have stayed buried. A dream, or so I thought, that twisted the very fabric of reality, leaving me questioning what was real. Imagine waking up in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, as if something from beyond had reached out and touched you. That's where my story begins. A nightmare so vivid it's still with me, lingering like a shadow waiting. Before I take you deeper into this darkness, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Trust me, you'll want to stay with me through this, because what I'm about to reveal isn't for the faint-hearted. These stories, they're for those brave enough to peer into the unknown, to confront the horrors lurking just out of sight. The truth is, we all have nightmares, but sometimes they don't end when we wake up. It began like any other night, a quiet, uneventful evening. But as soon as I drifted into sleep, I found myself in a place that felt wrong, deeply wrong. I was standing in the entrance of a grand, crumbling mansion, its once opulent walls now coated with mildew and a sickly, green mold that seemed to pulse in the dim light. The air was thick, damp, and heavy, like a suffocating blanket wrapped around my chest. I could smell the scent of decay, an overwhelming mixture of wet earth and something more unsettling, a metallic tang, like blood that had soaked into the very foundation of the place long ago. It filled my lungs with each breath, and with every inhale, I felt a growing dread clawing at the edges of my mind. As I took my first steps, the floorboards groaned beneath my weight, but the sound wasn't natural. It was more like a low, mournful creak, as if the house itself was warning me, or worse, inviting me in. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were watching me, that the shadows weren't just shadows, but something else entirely, something alive and ancient. The faint ticking sound, steady and rhythmic, echoed through the halls, but there was no visible clock, nothing to explain its presence. It was as if the very heart of the house was beating, slow and deliberate, keeping time with every uneasy breath I took. The deeper I wandered, the stranger things became. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones and makes your skin prickle. My footsteps seemed to lag in the silence, almost as if the house itself was absorbing the sound, letting me know it was watching. The floors beneath my feet felt soft, almost yielding, like the house was breathing underfoot, like the wood itself was rotting, or worse, moving. Each step became heavier, my feet sinking slightly, as if something underneath the floor was writhing, waiting for me to misstep, to fall. Then, as I turned a corner, I saw it. The mirror. It was tall, towering over me, its frame twisted and grotesque, like ancient roots entwining in agony. The glass wasn't clean. It shimmered unnaturally in the dim light, reflecting the room in a distorted, warped way that made my stomach turn. The frame itself seemed to breathe, the veins running through the wood pulsing faintly, as though alive. But what terrified me most was my reflection. It stared back at me with a frozen stillness that didn't match my movements. My reflection was delayed, slow, like it was watching me, analyzing me. There was a subtle wrongness about the image. The eyes. My eyes. They weren't mine. Dark, empty, voids that seemed to peer into my soul, dissecting my every thought. I should have turned back. I should have run, but I couldn't move. Something about the mirror, something about that place, drew me closer, as if an invisible hand was pulling me in. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming now, a sickening familiarity that clung to me like a shadow. I had been here before, but not in any waking memory. Maybe in a dream, maybe in a life I'd forgotten, but it was real. *2 real. The world around me felt suffocating, closing in on me with each second, yet I couldn't pull myself away from the mirror. I took one step closer, then another, until I was standing right in front of it, staring into the void of my own reflection, into the empty eyes that no longer felt like mine. That's when I noticed it. The ticking. It wasn't coming from a clock. It was coming from the mirror itself. It pulsed in time with my heartbeat, slow and deliberate, like the house was alive, feeding off my fear. My hands trembled as I reached out toward the glass, my fingertips just inches away. And then, as my reflection slowly tilted its head, just a fraction of a second too late, I realized whatever was staring back at me wasn't me. It was something else entirely, something that had been waiting there, behind the glass, for longer than I could comprehend. The air grew colder the further I ventured into the mansion. Every breath I took felt like inhaling ice, and my skin prickled with a chill that didn't come from the temperature alone. There was something watching me. Of that, I was certain. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted in unnatural ways, stretching out toward me as if they had a life of their own. At first, it was subtle. A flicker here, a movement just out of sight. But as I moved deeper into the house, it became more blatant. Objects seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, chairs inching closer to the table, curtains swaying as though touched by invisible hands, even though there was no wind. Each time I blinked, the room seemed to rearrange itself, ever so slightly. I wasn't alone, and yet I couldn't see what was there. I stumbled into what appeared to be a study, the air thick with the smell of old books and damp wood. The faint ticking sound had grown louder, but it was disjointed now, as if it was coming from multiple sources, surrounding me from all sides. My heart pounded my chest, its rhythm out of sync with the ticking, as though something was toying with time itself. I reached out to steady myself on an old desk, my fingers brushing against a thick layer of dust. But when I pulled my hand away, I realized something disturbing. The dust was undisturbed. No footprint, no mark, nothing to suggest that anyone had ever walked through the house, not even me. It was as if I wasn't even there, as if I was a ghost passing through a memory, or worse, someone else's nightmare. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something impossible. A figure moved in the mirror on the far wall, tall, shadowy, and unmistakably human. But it wasn't me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the figure passed by the mirror, gliding soundlessly across the room. It didn't acknowledge me, didn't even glance in my direction, but the terror it invoked was overwhelming. My mind screamed at me to look away, to run, but my body refused to obey. I watched as the figure disappeared around a corner, its form dissolving into the shadows. In that moment, the house felt alive, breathing, shifting, reacting to my presence. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the remnants of a bad dream. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something far more ancient than the crumbling walls that surrounded me. And then I heard it, a soft whisper so faint it could have been the wind, but it was unmistakable. It called my name, Ezra. I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see someone or something standing behind me, but the room was empty. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with a sense of dread that clung to my skin like cold sweat. I turned back toward the mirror, and that's when I saw it again. The door. A crack of light spilled from a doorway at the end of the hall, barely visible through the gloom. The light flickered, as if the source was dying or struggling to stay alive. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn around and escape whatever lay beyond that door. But I was drawn to it, like a moth to a flame, unable to resist the pull. I approached the door cautiously, the floorboards groaning louder beneath my feet with each step. The light inside was dim, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the door handle. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop, but curiosity, and something else, something darker, pushed me forward. I gently pushed the door open, the hinges creaking like a death rattle. Inside, the room was empty, except for one thing, another mirror. But this one was different, older, more ancient. Its frame was blackened, almost charred, and the glass was clouded with a strange, dark mist swirling just beneath the surface. My reflection was barely visible, a shadow of myself lost in the haze. As I stepped closer, The mist inside the mirror began to move, swirling faster and faster, like a storm trapped behind the glass. And then, for just a split second, I saw something, someone inside the mirror. It wasn't me. It was the figure from earlier, standing right behind me, its dark eyes staring into mine through the glass. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat tightened as panic surged through me. In that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a dream. I was no longer in control. Something else was here. Something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. As I stood frozen in front of the mirror, time seemed to stretch and warp around me. The air grew impossibly thick, like I was trapped underwater, each breath a struggle. The figure in the mirror, the dark, twisted version of me, was no longer just a reflection. It began to move independently, stepping toward me, while I remained rooted in place. My heart thundered in my chest as I watched, helpless, as this doppelganger mirrored every detail of my face, yet its eyes, black, bottomless voids, were not mine. They were something else entirely, something hungry. As it closed the distance between us, I realized with dawning horror that it was trying to take my place. Suddenly, everything around me shifted violently. The walls of the room warped, bending and twisting as if the house itself was being torn apart. The once solid floor beneath my feet trembled and groaned, splitting open in jagged cracks that revealed only an endless black void below. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond, as if invisible chains held me in place. A cold sweat drenched my skin, and my thoughts raced in frantic circles, searching for a way out. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. All I could hear was the relentless ticking, now deafening, as if time itself was about to shatter. Then, without warning, the figure in the mirror lunged forward. It reached through the glass as if it were liquid, its dark, clawed fingers curling around the edges of the mirror, pulling itself into the room with me. The coldness of its presence hit me like a wave, a darkness so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but it was too late. The thing that had been lurking in the mirror for so long was here now, real, tangible, and far more terrifying than I could have imagined. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I could feel its thoughts inside my head, cold and alien. It wasn't just here to haunt me. It was here to consume me. I tried to turn away, to escape, but the room itself began to collapse around me. The walls folded in on themselves, the ceiling cracking like a giant mouth about to swallow me whole. The mirror behind the figure began to ripple again, like water disturbed by a pebble, and I could see other reflections, more twisted, broken versions of myself, lurking just beneath the surface. They were watching, waiting for their turn. My vision blurred as the terror reached its peak. I knew that if I stayed in this place any longer, I would be lost forever. Another reflection trapped in the mirror, a prisoner of the darkness. In a last, desperate attempt, I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up. The ticking grew louder and louder, filling my head until it was unbearable, the sound of my own impending doom. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the world went silent. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the mansion. I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, my sheets twisted around me like a straitjacket. My heart raced, my chest heaving with each breath. But the room was still, too still. The faint glow of the digital clock on my nightstand caught my eye. 3:33 a.m., the same time as in my dream. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a nightmare. But something was wrong, very wrong. The sound, the faint ticking I had heard in the mansion, was still there. It echoed softly through the darkness of my bedroom, steady and rhythmic. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't coming from the clock. It was coming from inside the walls. I sat up, my skin prickling with dread, scanning the room for any sign that the nightmare wasn't over. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, the mirror stood, the same one from the dream, now impossibly real. Its surface rippled faintly, like water disturbed by something deep beneath. And in that moment, I understood. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had followed me into the waking world. The figure was still there, lurking just beyond the glass, waiting for the right moment to break through again. The next few days felt like I was walking through a fog, the line between reality and the nightmare I'd experienced becoming harder to distinguish. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, those empty, hollow eyes staring back at me, taunting me with the knowledge that it was still out there, watching. Even when I was awake, the faint ticking sound from the dream haunted me. It was always just at the edge of my hearing, soft and rhythmic, as if it had followed me from the dream world into my reality. But the most unsettling thing of all was the mirror in my room. It stood exactly where I had seen it in the dream, even though I didn't remember ever putting it there. It felt like the nightmare had bled into my waking life. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something I was missing. The dream, the figure in the mirror, the ticking. It all felt too real to be just a product of my imagination. So I began to research, searching online for any mention of similar experiences. At first, I found nothing, just the usual ghost stories and urban legends. But then, I stumbled upon a story that sent a chill down my spine. It was an old article, buried deep in the archives of a local newspaper, about a mansion that had once stood in the outskirts of town. One that matched the exact description of the house in my dream. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, shrouded in mystery after a series of strange disappearances. According to the article, people who had visited the mansion often reported strange occurrences, unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and most disturbingly, sightings of shadowy figures in the mirrors that lined the halls. Some claimed that these figures would mimic their movements, but with subtle, eerie differences, just like the twisted reflection I had seen in my dream. My heart pounded as I read further, my fingers trembling over the keyboard. The article went on to say that many of those who had reported these sightings later disappeared without a trace, their last known location always near a mirror. The deeper I dug, the more I found. There were whispers of an ancient curse tied to the mansion and the mirrors within it, mirrors that were said to be gateways to another world, a darker, twisted version of our own. Some claim that those who looked too long into the mirrors would be pulled into this mirror world, where their reflections would take their place in the real world, trapping them forever. My blood ran cold as I realized the parallels between the stories and my own experience. Could it be possible that I had stumbled into this mirror world in my dream? Was the figure I had seen trying to take my place? Desperate for answers, I decided to visit the mansion itself. I had to know if what I had dreamed was real, or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something strange. The ticking, the same sound that had haunted me since the dream, grew louder as I approached the mirror in my room. I hesitated, my heart racing, but I couldn't stop myself from stepping closer. When I peered into the glass, I saw it again, the faint ripple beneath the surface, like something was moving on the other side. That's when I saw a symbol etched faintly into the corner of the mirror's frame, one that I hadn't noticed before. It was spiral, ancient and worn, but unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I had seen that symbol before in the article about the mansion. It was the same mark that had been found carved into the mirrors of those who had disappeared. My hands trembled as I backed away from the mirror, the realization sinking in. This wasn't just a dream. It was real. And whatever had been waiting for me in that other world wasn't finished with me yet. In a panic, I rushed to my computer, looking for any trace of the mansion's location. I found it buried in old maps of the town, an abandoned estate on the outskirts, long forgotten by most. As I stared at the location on the screen, the ticking grew louder, echoing in my ears like a countdown. Something was drawing me to that place, and deep down, I knew I had to go. There was something waiting for me at that mansion, something that had followed me from the mirror world, and it wasn't going to stop until it found me. Driven by an overwhelming need for answers, I set out for the mansion. The journey there felt surreal, as if I were drifting between the waking world and the nightmare that had gripped me for days. The road leading to the mansion was overgrown, the trees towering above me like skeletal sentinels, their branches intertwining to blot out the sky. It felt like a passage into another world, a threshold that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The air grew colder the closer I got, and that faint, incessant ticking that had haunted me since the dream echoed louder in my mind. With each tick, I felt a growing sense of dread, as though I were being pulled deeper into something I couldn't escape. When I finally reached the mansion, it was even more decrepit than I had imagined. Its towering facade loomed over me, the windows shattered and dark, like soulless eyes staring down, waiting for my next move. The entire building seemed to sag under the weight of its forgotten history, as if it had been abandoned not just by people, but by time itself. I could feel it, the oppressive energy that clung to the place like a shroud. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, waiting for me to step inside. I hesitated for a moment at the entrance, the wooden door half hanging off its hinges, creaking in the breeze, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. I had to see what lay within. As I crossed the threshold, the air grew even colder, and the faint scent of decay filled my nostrils. The interior of the mansion was a ruin of its former glory. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, ragged strips, and the floors were warped and cracked beneath my feet. But despite the decay, there was something else, something unseen but palpable, an eerie presence that seemed to cling to every surface, watching, waiting. The familiar ticking sound echoed through the vast, empty halls, now louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a background noise. It was coming from somewhere inside the house, drawing me in. I began to explore, each step heavy with foreboding. The deeper I ventured into the mansion, the more I felt the walls closing in on me, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. I found myself in a long, narrow hallway lined with old, cracked mirrors. The reflections were distorted, twisted versions of reality. Every time I looked into one, I saw something move just beyond the edge of the glass, something dark and formless, watching me from within. My skin crawled with the sensation of being observed, not just by whatever lurked in the mirrors, but by the house itself. It felt like it was alive, feeding off my fear. And then, I wasn't alone. A voice called out from the shadows, soft and hoarse, like the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. I turned sharply, my heart pounding, and there, standing at the end of the hallway, was a man. He looked gaunt, his clothes tattered and covered in dust, as if he had been wandering the mansion for years. His eyes, wide and haunted, locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew he wasn't a figment of my imagination. He had been trapped here, just like me. His name was Silas, and as he stepped closer, I saw the deep lines of fear etched into his face. Silas began to speak in a low, trembling voice, telling me that he too had been lured to the mansion by dreams of mirrors, of shadows, and of something dark lurking just out of sight. He had come seeking answers, but instead, he found only terror. He explained that the mirrors in the mansion were gateways to another realm, a twisted reflection of our own world. And once you looked too deeply into them, you couldn't escape. The figures in the mirrors, the shadows that watched, they were waiting for their moment, waiting for you to make a mistake, to let your guard down, and then they would take you. I could feel my blood run cold as Silas recounted his own experience. He had seen the same figure, the same twisted reflection of himself, just as I had. And like me, he had tried to leave, but the house wouldn't let him. The mirrors wouldn't let him. The ticking sound that had haunted me for days grew louder, as if responding to Silas's words. It wasn't just a sound, it was a countdown, a warning that time was running out. Silas's voice cracked with desperation as he told me that he had been trapped here for what felt like years, unable to escape, unable to leave the world of the mirrors behind. As he spoke, I realized that I wasn't just fighting to escape the mansion. I was fighting to keep my identity, to hold on to who I was. The figure in the mirror wasn't just trying to haunt me, it was trying to replace me, to pull me into the mirror world and take my place in the real one. I had seen the signs, The subtle changes in my reflection, the way it moved just a fraction of a second too late, the way it watched me with those cold, empty eyes. It was waiting for me to slip up, to let in. The weight of Silas's words hit me like a punch to the gut. The mansion wasn't just a building, it was a prison. And the mirrors were its guards, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to trap their next victim. The ticking sound had become a deafening roar in my ears now, and I knew, deep down, that my time was running out. I had to escape. I had to find a way out of the mansion, out of this nightmare, before it consumed me. But as I looked around, the walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker. I realized with a sinking dread that the mansion had already claimed me, and there was no guarantee that I would ever leave. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in around me, the very air pressing down on my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. Silas's words echoed in my mind. Asterisk, the mirrors are gateways. Once you've looked too long, they claim you. Asterisk, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure in the mirror, the twisted version of myself, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting to pull me into that other world. The ticking sound was now deafening, as though time itself was about to run out. But something deeper, something darker, was pulling me forward, deeper into the heart of the mansion. With Silas by my side, I knew we had to reach the source of this nightmare, the place where it all began. Every step we took felt like a descent into madness, the floorboards creaking beneath us, the shadows twisting unnaturally on the walls. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off our fear, growing stronger the deeper we ventured. Finally, we reached the room that had haunted my dreams, the study. The door creaked open on its rusted hinges, revealing a large, ancient mirror at the center of the room. This was it, the mirror that had called to me in my dreams, the gateway to the other side. The mirror stood taller than the others, its frame dark and twisted, like roots clawing their way out of the earth. The glass shimmered faintly, as if something was moving just beneath the surface, waiting. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't stop. Silas stayed behind, his eyes wide with terror, knowing what was coming. The room was cold, far colder than the rest of the mansion, and with each step I took toward the mirror, the temperature seemed to drop further, until I could see my breath fogging the air in front of me. As I stood in front of the mirror, the ticking stopped. The silence was so complete, so absolute, that it felt as though the world itself had frozen. My reflection stared back at me, but it was different now. The figure in the mirror no longer mimicked my movements. It stood completely still, watching me with those dark, hollow eyes. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I realized that this reflection was no longer me. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting inside the mirror for far too long. And now, it wanted to escape. Suddenly, the surface of the mirror began to ripple, as though the glass had turned to liquid. The reflection's face twisted into a grotesque smile, its mouth stretching wider than any human mouth should. I stumbled back, heart racing, but it was too late. The figure reached out of the mirror, its fingers long and sharp like claws, tearing through the veil between worlds. It grabbed hold of my arm with a grip like ice, pulling me toward the glass. I struggled, trying to break free, but the mirror's pull was too strong. The surface shimmered like water, and I could feel myself being dragged into the other side, the coldness seeping into my bones. As I fought against the creature, my eyes locked onto something, an old, leather-bound journal lying on a nearby table. Desperation surged through me, and with one final effort, I tore myself free from the creature's grasp and lunged for the journal. My fingers closed around it, and as I flipped it open, my heart sank. Inside were entries written by others, dozens of others, who had experienced the same nightmare, the same twisted reflections, and had vanished without a trace. Their stories all ended the same, with them being pulled into the mirror world, never to return. But there was something else, a symbol scrawled in the margins of the journal, the same spiral I had seen etched into the frame of the mirror in my room. It was a key, a way to break the mirror's hold, a way to stop the reflection from taking my place. My pulse pounded in my ears as I realized what I had to do. The journal described a ritual, a choice, one that would determine whether I stayed in this world or was lost forever to the mirror. I had to confront the reflection. I had to face it head on and make a choice. The figure in the mirror had fully emerged now, its form dark and twisted, towering over me. Its eyes, black as the void, bored into mine, as if it was staring into my soul, waiting for me to falter. The journal trembled in my hands as I began the ritual, speaking the words aloud, my voice shaking with fear. The creature snarled, its mouth twisting into an inhuman grin as it lunged at me, its claws reaching for my throat. But I stood my ground, forcing myself to keep chanting, to keep going, even as the room around me began to warp and twist, the very walls of the mansion melting away into darkness. And then, just as the creature's claws grazed my skin, everything stopped. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the glass exploding outward with a deafening crash. The creature howled, a sound so unnatural it felt like the air itself was tearing apart, and then it was gone, sucked back into the void beyond the mirror. The room was silent again, the only sound my ragged breathing as I stood amidst the broken glass, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. But something was wrong. The air was still cold, too cold, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. I glanced down at the shattered mirror, at the countless shards that littered the floor, and froze. In every piece of glass, I could still see the reflection, the twisted, dark version of myself, staring back at me from the other side. I wasn't free. The nightmare wasn't over. And as the faint ticking sound began again, I realized with growing horror that it might never end. The mansion had fallen into a suffocating silence, the only sound my shallow breathing as I stood surrounded by shattered glass. My heart pounded, a chaotic rhythm in my chest, but the sense of dread was deeper now, more profound. Something was wrong. Very asterisk wrong. I had shattered the mirror, broken connection, but the air was still cold, too cold. The feeling of being watched had not left me. If anything, it had intensified. I knelt down, picking up one of the shards, and froze. Reflected in every piece of glass scattered on the floor was the dark figure, still watching me from within the fragments. Its twisted grin, the hollow eyes, it was all still there, staring up at me from 1,000 different angles, from 1,000 different pieces. My blood turned to ice as I realized it hadn't been banished. It had only been split. The reflection hadn't disappeared. It had multiplied. The dark version of myself was no longer contained to one mirror. It was in all of them, waiting, watching, with more eyes now than I could comprehend. The faint ticking sound that had haunted me since the dream began again, slowly at first, but then growing louder, more insistent, like a countdown. I backed away from the shards, my mind racing. The ritual had failed, or maybe it had never been intended to work. Maybe the journal, the mansion, everything had been a trap from the start, luring me deeper into the nightmare, making me believe I could escape. But there was no escape. The mirror world, the reflection, the ticking, it was all still with me, and it wasn't finished. I stumbled out of the room, but the mansion itself felt different now. The walls seemed to shift and bend as I moved, the shadows clinging to me like hungry fingers. Every window I passed, every piece of glass in the house reflected the dark figure, now present in every corner of my vision. No matter where I looked, there it was, waiting, following, biding its time. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, each one accompanied by that incessant ticking. I wasn't alone in the house, and I knew that now more than ever. The mansion had claimed me, just as it had claimed Silas and countless others before me. I burst through the front door, desperate for fresh air, for the warmth of the outside world. But as I stepped out onto the overgrown path, the cold still clung to me, wrapping around my body like a shroud. The ticking followed, a relentless beat in my mind that I couldn't shake. I glanced around, trying to find a sense of normalcy in the outside world, but everything felt off. The trees, the sky, even the very air felt wrong, as though the world itself had shifted. It was as if I had crossed an invisible boundary and was no longer sure whether I was in the real world or still trapped inside the mirror's twisted reflection. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape around me never changed. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like the frame of the mirrors, their shadows following me no matter which direction I turned. I pulled the journal from my coat, flipping through its pages, desperate for any clue, any final piece of the puzzle. And that's when I saw it. A single, scrawled entry near the back, written in a frantic hand. Asterisk, the mirror world follows. Once it's seen you, it never lets go. Don't trust your reflection. Don't look too long. It's always watching. My stomach dropped as I realized the full extent of what I was facing. The nightmare wasn't confined to the mansion. It was with me, and it always had been. The reflection in the mirror world wasn't just trying to replace me. It was replacing me, little by little, moment by moment. Every time I caught my reflection in a piece of glass, every time I heard that ticking, I was losing a part of myself to it. Soon, there would be nothing left of me, only the dark figure, the twisted version of myself that had been waiting in the shadows for so long. I reached the edge of the woods, but even the world beyond felt distorted now, as though I was still looking at everything through the warped lens of a mirror. The ticking was louder than ever, pounding in my ears, and I could feel the reflection, the thing from the mirror world, pressing closer, growing stronger. My mind raced with questions. Was this still a dream? Had I ever truly left the mirror world, or had it pulled me in completely? Was the real world just a reflection now, and I the shadow trapped in it? In the distance, I saw a faint figure approaching. My heart leapt with hope for just a moment, but then I saw it. The same hollow eyes, the same twisted smile. The dark version of myself was walking toward me, growing closer with every second. I could feel its presence, suffocating, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. There was no escape. I was trapped in its world now, and had finally come to claim what was left of me. The last thing I remember is the cold touch of its fingers wrapping around my wrist, pulling me back into the darkness. And then, nothing. I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by bright lights and the sterile smell of antiseptic. The doctors told me I had been found unconscious near an old abandoned mansion, but they had no explanation for how I got there, or why I had been in such a state. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They said it was a hallucination, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But I know the truth. The ticking is still there, faint but constant, always in the background. And every time I look in a mirror, even just for a second, I see it. The dark figure, watching, waiting. The nightmare isn't over. It never will be. Was it all just a dream? Or have I been trapped in the mirror world this entire time, with the real me lost forever? The truth is, I don't know. But if you ever find yourself standing in front of a mirror and notice something off, something that doesn't quite match, don't look too long. Don't let it see you. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe, leave your thoughts and theories in the comments, and share this story. Because sometimes, the nightmares we think we leave behind are the ones that follow us home. And the next time you look in the mirror, be careful. You might not be alone.